Was it fate, misfortune, or something far more sinister that seemed to haunt one of the most powerful dynasties in European history? The Habsburgs ruled over a vast empire, shaping the destinies of nations for centuries, yet their legacy is marred by a chilling pattern of tragedy. Mysterious deaths, doomed romances, twisted genetics, and a collapse so spectacular it feels torn from the pages of a Gothic novel. Could all of this really be coincidence? Or was the family touched by a curse that no crown could protect them from? Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, where history comes alive through stories as gripping as any thriller. In this video, we unravel the haunting legacy of the Habsburgs and explore how their so-called curse echoed through generations, leaving behind a trail of sorrow, scandal, and mystery that still fascinates the world today. Was it divine retribution, a string of bad luck, or something more sinister that plagued Europe's most powerful dynasty? The Habsburgs, a family whose dominion once spanned continents and whose influence shaped the very fabric of European history, have long intrigued historians and laypeople alike. They ruled empires, brokered alliances, and controlled thrones from Madrid to Vienna, yet their reign was shadowed by recurring tragedy, genetic afflictions, and political collapse. Their story is not just a chronicle of ascension and governance, but also one of grotesque misfortune and eerie coincidence that led many to wonder whether fate itself had turned against them. At their zenith, the Habsburg dynasty was a towering colossus in the political landscape of Europe. Through a mixture of strategic marriages, military prowess, and shrewd diplomacy, they gathered lands and titles that gave rise to the saying, "Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry." Their empire included the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish throne, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast colonies in the New World. In an age when empires defined global power, the Habsburgs were imperial royalty in the truest sense. Their castles were imposing, their wealth seemingly inexhaustible, and their family tree intertwined with almost every significant royal house in Europe. Yet, behind the grandeur of palaces and coronations, the Habsburg family bore a heavy burden, an undercurrent of doom that would surface repeatedly over centuries. One of the most infamous aspects of their legacy is the peculiar and often grotesque appearance of many family members, most notably the protruding lower jaw, known medically as mandibular prognathism, or colloquially as the Habsburg jaw. This condition was not simply a cosmetic anomaly, but often came with severe health complications. It was the byproduct of generations of inbreeding, a practice meant to preserve royal bloodlines, but which instead ensured the propagation of genetic disorders. The Habsburgs' obsession with keeping power within the family saw marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, some to such a degree that entire branches of the family were genetically indistinguishable. Consider Charles II of Spain, often cited as the most tragic product of this genetic entrapment. Born in the mid-17th century, Charles was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain and the embodiment of his family's physical and mental decline. He suffered from a host of ailments. He was physically deformed, mentally impaired, epileptic, and infertile. His autopsy revealed that he had only one shriveled testicle and a heart that was reportedly the size of a peppercorn. Unable to rule effectively, Charles became a pawn in the hands of courtiers and foreign powers. His death without an heir precipitated the War of the Spanish Succession, plunging Europe into yet another devastating conflict. It was a moment that signaled the beginning of the end for Habsburg dominance. But the misfortunes of the Habsburgs were not confined to genetics. The political landscape they helped shape often turned against them. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars dismantled much of the old feudal order that had propped up dynasties like the Habsburgs. They adapted by rebranding the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire into the Austrian Empire, but they were forever playing catch-up in a world increasingly hostile to monarchic rule. The 19th century brought waves of liberal revolutions and nationalist uprisings, movements that sought to dismantle empires and build nations based on shared language, ethnicity, and culture. The Habsburgs, ruling over a multi-ethnic patchwork of lands, became an anachronism. Theirs was a world of divine right and courtly ritual, increasingly at odds with a new world driven by ideas of democracy and self-determination. Perhaps no figure symbolizes the tragic fall of the Habsburgs more poignantly than Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke whose assassination in Sarajevo in the year 1914 lit the fuse that exploded into the First World War. Franz Ferdinand was not a particularly beloved figure within the dynasty. His morganatic marriage to Sophie Chotek was seen as a breach of dynastic protocol. Yet, ironically, it was his death that proved most consequential. The bullets that killed him also doomed millions, including the Habsburg Empire itself. By the end of the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the crown jewel of Habsburg dominion, had disintegrated. Emperor Charles I, who had tried desperately to keep the empire together, was forced into exile. The once proud dynasty was reduced to a ghost, its members scattered across Europe. Even outside politics, the Habsburgs seemed unable to escape the shadows of misfortune. Consider the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known affectionately as Sisi. She was a figure of beauty and romantic melancholy, adored by the public, but trapped in an unhappy marriage and a stifling court life. Sisi's life was marked by tragedy. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide at Mayerling, a scandal that shocked the empire. She herself was later assassinated in Geneva by an Italian anarchist, a random act of violence that seemed to underline how even the most glamorous members of the Habsburg family were not immune to the chaos of a changing world. One might argue that the Habsburg misfortunes were not entirely of their own making. They ruled in tumultuous times, and their vast empire made them natural targets for rebellion, revolution, and foreign intrigue. But others suggest that the dynasty sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Their refusal to modernize, their insistence on archaic traditions, their relentless pursuit of intrafamilial marriages, all contributed to their slow decay. They were a family that viewed themselves as chosen by God, yet were frequently humbled by the frailty of their own blood and the unrelenting tide of history. Religious zeal also played a curious role in Habsburg misfortunes. As defenders of Catholicism during the Reformation, they launched and sustained long wars that drained their coffers and fractured their lands. The 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, had its roots in the religious absolutism of the Habsburgs. While they may have emerged with some of their territories intact, the war left much of Central Europe in ruins. Their rigid adherence to Catholic orthodoxy made them enemies of Protestant princes and alienated potential allies. Ironically, the very faith that had once legitimized their rule now narrowed their options and contributed to their decline. Furthermore, their geographical expanse, once a sign of strength, became a liability. Governing such a diverse realm meant dealing with competing languages, cultures, and national aspirations. The Hungarian question, the Slavic dilemma, the Italian restlessness. Each required different policies, different sensibilities, and none could be reconciled easily under one imperial roof. Their solution, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of the year 1867, which created the dual monarchy, was more a band-aid than a cure. It pleased the Hungarians temporarily, but did little to quell unrest among Czechs, Croats, and others. Even their attempts at modernization came too late or too timidly. Their bureaucracy, though efficient in some respects, was often paralyzed by court politics and a fear of reform. Education, industry, and military advancement lagged behind Prussia and other European powers. By the time of the First World War, Austria-Hungary was derided as a ramshackle empire, ill-equipped to compete on the modern battlefield or in the political arena. The dynasty's cultural achievements, while considerable, were also marked by a sense of melancholy. They patronized the arts, supported composers like Haydn and Mozart, and turned Vienna into a cultural capital. But even in their artistic legacy, one senses a tension between the magnificence of form and the anxiety of substance. The Viennese waltz, with its graceful turns and dizzying elegance, mirrors the empire's own trajectory, beautiful, structured, but ultimately spinning toward collapse. And then there is the matter of the Habsburg curse, a term whispered more in folk tradition and speculative histories than in scholarly texts, but one that reflects the almost mythic sense of doom that surrounded the family. Whether one believes in actual curses is beside the point. What matters is that even contemporaries saw a pattern in their suffering. From madness to assassination, from infertility to exile, the family endured a litany of calamities that seemed to defy mere coincidence. The final Habsburg ruler, Charles I, attempted to reclaim his throne in Hungary twice after being dethroned in the aftermath of the First World War. Both attempts failed, and he was sent into exile on the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died in poverty and obscurity in the year 1922. It was a quiet end for a family that had once dominated the stage of European history. His beatification by the Catholic Church in the year 2004 was a nod to his piety, but it did little to restore the grandeur of a name that had become synonymous with faded glory. Today, the remnants of the Habsburg family live relatively ordinary lives. Some are academics, others businesspeople, a few still dabble in politics or attend royal events. The name still carries a certain mystique, especially in Austria and Spain, but its power has long since evaporated. Their palaces are now museums, their portraits artifacts, their once feared armies now entries in history books. The weight of the crown they bore has been lifted, but its legacy remains a cautionary tale about the perils of absolute power, the folly of pride, and the unpredictable turns of fortune. The story of the Habsburgs is not just a saga of one family, but a mirror to the broader currents of European history. Their rise and fall reflect the transitions from medieval theocracy to early modern empire, from feudal loyalty to national consciousness, from divine right to democratic principle. Whether it was divine retribution, genetic destiny, or the slow unraveling of unsustainable ambition, the Habsburgs' legacy endures, not just in their ruins, but in the way they remind us of history's capacity for both grandeur and catastrophe. The Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful and enduring royal houses in European history, is remembered not only for its political and military influence, but also for the peculiar and tragic physical traits that plagued many of its members. Among these, the most infamous was the so-called Habsburg jaw, a pronounced mandibular prognathism that became a hallmark of the family's appearance over several generations. This distinct physical trait was not merely cosmetic. It was the visible symptom of a deeper, more insidious genetic legacy, rooted in the centuries-long practice of intermarriage among close relatives. In the early days of the dynasty, marrying within royal circles was considered a diplomatic necessity. To preserve alliances, consolidate power, and protect dynastic legitimacy, the Habsburgs frequently arranged marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and other close relations. While this practice may have succeeded in keeping lands and titles within the family, it also set the stage for a cascade of genetic disorders that would haunt them for centuries. With each generation, the risks of hereditary conditions multiplied, and the consequences began to show not just in the physiognomy of the royal portraits, but in the lives and health of the individuals themselves. The Habsburg jaw, known in medical terms as mandibular prognathism, is a condition where the lower jaw protrudes significantly beyond the upper jaw. This results in a distinctive facial profile that was especially evident in members like Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th century, and his descendant, Charles II of Spain, who lived in the 17th century. The jaw was not just an aesthetic oddity, it came with significant functional impairments. Individuals with this condition often experience difficulty speaking clearly, chewing food properly, and maintaining oral hygiene. These problems could lead to malnutrition, chronic pain, and a reduced quality of life, hardly conducive to the demands of monarchy. In the case of Charles V, while his jaw was prominent, he remained a capable and formidable ruler. He oversaw a vast empire where the sun famously never set and managed to navigate the complex religious and political terrain of Reformation-era Europe. However, even he was not immune to the effects of his family's inbreeding. He suffered from epilepsy, gout, and severe digestive problems. Toward the end of his life, his health deteriorated rapidly, leading to his abdication and retreat into a monastery. Though his intellect and will were strong, his body bore the marks of a genetic inheritance that would become more pronounced in his descendants. The true culmination of the Habsburg genetic decline came with Charles II of Spain. Born in the year 1661, Charles was the result of generations of increasingly close familial unions. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, making Charles the product of a relationship with very little genetic diversity. The result was a ruler whose physical and mental conditions were so debilitating that many contemporaries believed he had been cursed. Charles was described by courtiers and foreign diplomats as frail, sickly, and intellectually impaired. He suffered from a weak immune system, frequent seizures, and digestive issues that left him undernourished. His speech was slurred, and he could barely chew solid food due to the deformity of his jaw. More tragically, he was unable to produce an heir, despite being married twice. His infertility was the final nail in the coffin for the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. When he died in the year 1700, childless and broken, The Spanish crown passed to the Bourbon family, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession. Charles II's reign is perhaps the clearest embodiment of how a dynasty's physical health could intertwine with the political fate of nations. The Habsburg jaw, while the most visually striking trait, was not the only genetic issue that afflicted the dynasty. A range of other conditions, including epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, and musculoskeletal deformities, appeared with alarming frequency in royal family members. These conditions, often misunderstood at the time, added to the sense of unease and even superstition surrounding the Habsburgs. In an age when science had yet to fully explain heredity, many interpreted these afflictions as signs of divine judgment or even witchcraft. The term Habsburg curse began to gain currency, not merely as a metaphor for political misfortune, but as a way to explain the physical and psychological suffering that seemed endemic to the family. One of the reasons these genetic problems became so deeply embedded in the family is the repeated practice of consanguineous marriage, unions between individuals who share a common ancestor. In the case of the Habsburgs, this was not occasional but systematic. An analysis of the Spanish Habsburgs, in particular, shows that the average coefficient of inbreeding among them was higher than that of any other European royal family. In simple terms, their genetic pool became a closed loop, reinforcing not only familial loyalty, but also hereditary defects. Maria Anna of Spain, another tragic figure in this lineage, married her uncle, Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Though their union was politically strategic, it further tightened the web of shared genetics. Their children showed signs of developmental delays and poor health. Similarly, Joanna of Austria, sister to Charles V, was known for her severe mood swings and depressive episodes, conditions that, while not conclusively diagnosed in modern terms, hint at possible mental health issues rooted in genetic vulnerability. The repeated appearance of these conditions created a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Medical historians today view the Habsburg dynasty as a case study in the dangers of inbreeding. Their story is often cited in genetics courses and textbooks as a historical example of how closed bloodlines can lead to the manifestation of recessive traits. Traits that might have remained dormant in a broader genetic pool were amplified and exacerbated by the Habsburgs' marriage practices. The social and political implications of these genetic issues were immense. In a time when monarchs were expected to be paragons of strength, wisdom, and divine favor, the visibly impaired and cognitively limited Habsburg rulers undermined the very legitimacy of hereditary monarchy. Courtly protocol required endless ceremony to obscure the deficiencies of the monarch, and ministers often ruled in their stead, manipulating policies behind a facade of royal authority. This weakening of the monarchy's public image had long-term consequences, eroding confidence in the system and inviting foreign intervention or internal rebellion. Public perception of the Habsburgs began to shift accordingly. Once viewed as God's chosen rulers, they came to be seen by many as a tragic relic of a bygone era. Caricatures of the Habsburg jaw appeared in pamphlets and artworks, mocking their appearance and hinting at the decay of their empire. These portrayals were not just expressions of aesthetic critique, but political commentary, illustrating how the physical became symbolic of the moral and institutional decline of the dynasty. Even as Enlightenment thinking began to take hold in Europe, with its emphasis on reason, science, and individual merit, the Habsburgs remained trapped in a worldview that elevated bloodline above all else. Their reluctance to abandon intrafamily marriages, even in the face of mounting evidence of its consequences, showed a stubbornness that alienated them from the emerging modern sensibilities. In this way, the genetic legacy of the Habsburgs was not just biological but ideological, a refusal to adapt that ultimately led to their fall. Another tragic figure worth noting is Leopold II, Holy Roman Emperor during the late 18th century. Though less visibly afflicted than Charles II, he was aware of the genetic burden that his family carried. He attempted to introduce reforms that would modernize the empire, including policies aimed at improving public health and education. Yet even he could not entirely escape the dynastic expectation of marrying within a narrow circle. The pressure to maintain royal bloodlines outweighed any personal or scientific understanding of genetic risk. The broader implications of the Habsburg genetic legacy can be felt even beyond the confines of history. Their story offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of insularity, whether biological, political, or ideological. In their attempt to preserve purity, they created fragility. In their desire for unity, they sowed division. In their pursuit of divine favor, they experienced what many believed to be divine punishment. In modern times, the study of the Habsburgs has helped geneticists better understand the consequences of inbreeding. Genetic mapping of known family traits and diseases has offered insights into how recessive conditions manifest and propagate. Researchers have found that the extreme consanguinity of the Spanish Habsburgs led to higher incidences of congenital disorders, immune system deficiencies, and developmental delays. These findings have contributed not only to medical science, but also to historical scholarship, offering a more nuanced understanding of how biology intersected with power in early modern Europe. The story of the Habsburg jaw and the broader spectrum of genetic afflictions within the family is thus not just about a quirk of appearance. It is about the complex interplay of biology, politics, and perception. It is about how a visible trait can become a symbol, how a family's private health issues can become a matter of public consequence, and how the refusal to adapt can lead even the mightiest empires to collapse. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed their blood set them apart, marked them as chosen, superior, and enduring. In the end, it was that very blood that betrayed them. And yet, within the tragedy of the Habsburg genetic legacy lies a certain human poignancy. These were not abstract symbols or case studies in textbooks. They were people, often burdened from birth with physical pain, psychological torment, and enormous expectations. They lived in palaces but often died in suffering and solitude. Some tried to break the cycle, others succumbed to it, but all were caught in the web spun by centuries of decisions made in the name of power and tradition. The notion of a curse, whether literal or metaphorical, continues to color how people think about the Habsburgs. It serves as a narrative device to explain the inexplicable, to make sense of a dynasty that rose so high and fell so hard. But if there is a curse, it was one of their own making, a consequence of choices driven by fear of dilution rather than hope for renewal, by obsession with control rather than openness to change. The Habsburg jaw is not just a feature of bone and flesh. It is a reminder of how history carves itself into the human body, how power leaves its mark not only on the pages of treaties and chronicles, but also on the faces of those who wield it. The legacy it leaves is one of grandeur intertwined with sorrow, triumph shadowed by decline, and lineage both revered and regretted. Through their visible deformities and hidden ailments, the Habsburgs remind us that no empire is immune to the fundamental truths of human nature, that in the end, we are all shaped by the choices of those who came before us. The history of the Habsburg dynasty is filled with political triumphs, imperial expansions, and complex alliances, but woven throughout their reign is a tapestry of personal pain and heartbreak. Behind the grandeur of palaces, court ceremonies, and treaties were intimate dramas that played out in private corridors and distant villas. Love affairs doomed by duty, marriages arranged without affection, and tragedies that became the subject of gossip across Europe. At the heart of many of these emotional sagas lies one of the most enigmatic figures in European royal history, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known more famously as Sisi. Her life and death, along with the Mayerling incident involving her only son, and a string of failed royal marriages and betrayals, cast a long shadow over the Habsburg legacy. These personal tragedies were not isolated episodes. They chipped away at the illusion of divine rule and exposed the very human vulnerabilities of Europe's most powerful family. Elizabeth of Bavaria married Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria when she was just a teenager. From the beginning, her life at court was far from a fairy tale. Though her husband was genuinely enamored with her, Sisi found the rigid protocol of the Viennese court suffocating. She had grown up with relative freedom in the Bavarian countryside, and the transition to the stifling ceremonial life of the Habsburg court was deeply traumatic. She struggled to adapt to her new role as empress and to the expectations of her husband's domineering mother, Archduchess Sophie, who immediately took control over matters such as the upbringing of Sisi's children. This loss of agency became a recurring theme in her life. From early on, Elizabeth displayed a rebellious spirit. She rejected many court customs, distanced herself from political affairs, and developed an intense obsession with beauty and fitness that bordered on the pathological. Her diet was extremely restrictive, and she exercised compulsively, often spending hours walking or riding horses. She refused to be photographed as she aged, terrified of losing the beauty that had captivated the empire. Her waist remained impossibly small, even into her 40s, due to her use of tight corsets. While the public admired her elegance, few knew the depth of her emotional turmoil. Her restlessness found expression in constant travel. Sisi roamed across Europe, often alone or with a small entourage, seeking refuge from the pressures of court life. She visited Hungary frequently, where she found a sense of warmth and acceptance missing from Vienna. Her relationship with Hungary became so strong that she played a crucial role in persuading Franz Joseph to agree to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of the year 1867, which created the dual monarchy. Yet, even her political achievements could not soothe the personal anguish that haunted her. Tragedy struck repeatedly in her life. Her first daughter, Sophie, died in infancy during a trip to Hungary, a loss that Sisi never fully recovered from. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, grew increasingly estranged from his parents, particularly his father, with whom he clashed over politics and values. Rudolf was progressive in outlook, sympathetic to liberal reforms, and disillusioned with the autocratic traditions of the empire. His relationship with his mother, though more affectionate than with his father, was still marked by emotional distance. The defining scandal of Sisi's life, and one of the darkest moments in Habsburg history, was the Mayerling incident. In the early morning hours of a cold January day in the year 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead at the Royal Hunting Lodge in Mayerling. The official story claimed it was a murder-suicide, with Rudolf killing Mary before turning the gun on himself. The Habsburg court scrambled to cover up the scandal, going so far as to declare Rudolf temporarily insane so that he could be buried in consecrated ground. The Mayerling tragedy sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Rudolf was the only son of the emperor and the heir to the throne. His death not only shattered the imperial family, but also threw the succession into uncertainty. His political leanings had hinted at a potential shift in the direction of the monarchy, and his death dashed hopes for reform and modernization. The empire had lost its future, and Franz Joseph never recovered from the blow. Elizabeth, already reeling from years of depression and isolation, was further devastated. She wore black for the rest of her life and withdrew almost entirely from public appearances. The official narrative surrounding Mayerling was carefully managed, but speculation and conspiracy theories flourished. Some believed Rudolf had been assassinated to silence his liberal ideas. Others thought Mary had coerced him into a suicide pact, or that she herself had been a victim. The truth remains elusive, but the broader impact was clear. The imperial family's image suffered irreparable damage. The people of Austria, once in awe of the regal dynasty, now saw a family plagued by dysfunction, secrecy, and sorrow. Elizabeth's own death would be no less tragic. In the year 1898, while traveling incognito in Geneva, she was assassinated by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Licini. The assassin had intended to kill any royal figure he could find, and seized upon Elizabeth simply because she was accessible. Stabbed in the heart with a sharpened file, she initially seemed to recover, only to collapse shortly afterward and die within hours. Her death was shocking not just for its violence, but for its senselessness. Here was a woman who had fled the trappings of royalty, only to be targeted because of her title. Her assassination underscored the growing hostility toward monarchy at the turn of the century, a sign of the times that the age of empires was drawing to a close. But the tales of romantic tragedy in the Habsburg lineage did not begin or end with Elizabeth and Rudolf. Throughout their long history, members of the dynasty experienced doomed marriages, infidelities, and scandals that undermined both their personal happiness and the legitimacy of their rule. Franz Joseph himself, despite his devotion to Elizabeth, had affairs during their marriage. While Sisi wandered Europe in search of solace, he remained in Vienna, occasionally seeking companionship elsewhere. Though discreet, these liaisons were an open secret, and they contributed to the emotional distance between the imperial couple. The emperor, rigid in discipline and deeply conservative, could not understand Elizabeth's melancholic temperament and yearning for freedom. Their marriage, though politically advantageous, was marked more by mutual respect than emotional intimacy. Archduchess Marie Valerie, the youngest daughter of Franz Joseph and Elizabeth, was perhaps the closest to a content royal marriage, but even her life was not without controversy. Though she was allowed to choose her own husband, Archduke Franz Salvatore of Austria-Tuscany, the marriage eventually became strained due to his infidelities. Marie Valerie, once adored as the only child because Elizabeth had finally taken a maternal role in raising her, found herself trapped in a union reminiscent of those that had tormented earlier generations. Other marriages within the extended Habsburg family were similarly disastrous. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive after Rudolf's death, fell in love with Sophie Chotek, a lady-in-waiting of noble but non-royal birth. Their marriage was morganatic, meaning that Sophie and their children would not inherit Franz Ferdinand's titles or rights. This unequal status caused endless friction at court, where Sophie was frequently snubbed and excluded from imperial events. Despite these humiliations, the couple remained devoted to each other until their assassination in Sarajevo in the year 1914, a tragic end that served as the immediate trigger for the First World War. The marginalization of Sophie by the imperial family was symptomatic of the broader rigidity that defined the Habsburg court. Love, when it conflicted with protocol, was often sacrificed. The family's adherence to archaic rules about bloodline and status left little room for genuine affection, and those who dared to follow their hearts were often punished or sidelined. This inflexibility not only destroyed individual lives, but contributed to a perception of the monarchy as outdated and inhumane. Infidelity was another recurring theme in Habsburg romantic history. Many royal spouses sought solace outside their marriages, either in extramarital affairs or in long-term relationships with unofficial partners. These affairs, while sometimes tolerated, often led to scandal. Rumors of mistresses, illegitimate children, and court intrigues circulated widely, particularly in the later years of the empire when press restrictions began to loosen. Such stories eroded the aura of sacredness that had once surrounded the monarchy and made the Habsburgs appear more like flawed mortals than divinely chosen rulers. One lesser-known but poignant example is Archduchess Maria Theresa of Tuscany, who married Duke Charles Louis of Parma. Their marriage, though politically advantageous, was marred by emotional coldness and public disgrace. Charles Louis was rumored to be unfaithful and irresponsible, preferring a life of hedonism to his duties as a consort. Maria Theresa, humiliated and isolated, retreated into religious devotion and charitable work, but never found personal fulfillment. Over time, these romantic misfortunes began to accumulate into a broader narrative of dynastic decay. The love lives of the Habsburgs, once closely guarded secrets, became matters of public consumption and ridicule. In Vienna, jokes and songs about the misadventures of the imperial family circulated among commoners, a sign that reverence had turned to disillusionment. Where once emperors and empresses were seen as figures of near-divine status, they were increasingly viewed as tragic, often pathetic characters unable to manage their personal affairs. This shift in perception was not without consequence. The credibility of monarchy rested not just on political authority, but on moral example. When emperors could not maintain harmonious families or protect their children from despair and death, their claims to moral leadership faltered. In an era of rising Republican sentiment and social upheaval, these personal failures fed into a larger narrative about the obsolescence of aristocracy. The people began to ask, if the rulers of Europe could not rule themselves, how could they be trusted to govern nations? The love stories of the Habsburgs are not merely footnotes in a larger history of wars and treaties. They are central to understanding the emotional and psychological toll of life inside a royal dynasty. These were people born into immense privilege, but often denied the most basic human freedoms: freedom to love, to grieve openly, to live without relentless scrutiny. Their romances gone wrong are not just gossip from the past. They are reflections of a system that prioritized legacy over happiness, appearance over authenticity, and tradition over change. The legacy of Empress Elizabeth, Crown Prince Rudolph, and others who suffered under the weight of dynastic expectations remains hauntingly relevant. Their lives remind us that behind every crown lies a human being, vulnerable to the same desires and sorrows as anyone else. In their scandals and tragedies, we see not just the downfall of a family, but the slow unraveling of an idea, the idea that royalty is immune to the human condition. The Habsburgs, in their grandeur and in their grief, prove that even the mightiest are not spared the pain of love lost, lives unfulfilled, and fates forever changed by the choices of the heart. Throughout the centuries-long reign of the Habsburg dynasty, a cloud of mystery and suspicion seemed to hover over the imperial court. While illness and age claimed many members of this formidable royal house, numerous deaths and untimely demises were surrounded by secrecy, political tension, or whispers of foul play. These were not merely tragic events within a powerful family. They were catalysts for intrigue, rumor, and speculation that sometimes reached mythic proportions. Whether it was the sudden collapse of an archduke, an unexplained suicide, or a violent assassination, each incident added to the pervasive sense that the Habsburgs were haunted not only by internal pressures, but also by external enemies, and perhaps something even more intangible, a sense of doom that seemed to pursue them from generation to generation. One of the earliest and most influential episodes that fostered this atmosphere of suspicion was the sudden death of Archduke John of Austria in the 17th century. A brilliant military commander, an illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V, John was hailed as a hero after his victory at the Battle of Lepanto. Despite his success and popularity, he died unexpectedly in his early 30s. While official records attributed his death to natural causes, speculation quickly grew that he had been poisoned, possibly by rivals within the court who feared his influence or his ambition. Though no evidence was ever confirmed, the fact that an energetic and beloved figure could die so young ignited the belief that shadowy forces were at work even within the family itself. Poison, in fact, became a recurrent theme in Habsburg history. The court of Vienna was rife with paranoia, and the use of poison as a political tool was not merely a literary invention. In a world where royal succession meant control over vast territories and immense wealth, the sudden death of an heir or rival could dramatically shift the balance of power. One of the most frequently cited cases of suspected poisoning was the death of Emperor Leopold I's second wife, Empress Margarita Theresa. Though her health had been fragile for much of her short life, her early demise, paired with the fact that she had failed to produce a healthy male heir, raised eyebrows. Some contemporaries whispered that she had been eliminated to make way for a more politically advantageous match. As the dynasty expanded its reach across Europe, alliances grew more complicated and threats more diverse. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs was particularly vulnerable to suspicion. Charles II of Spain, already burdened with severe physical and mental impairments due to generations of inbreeding, became a focal point of countless rumors. His court was consumed by intrigue, as factions vied for control over a monarch who was incapable of governing effectively. His death in the year 1700 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, and while his myriad health issues could easily explain his death, some believed he had been quietly dispatched to make way for a Bourbon heir. In the ensuing chaos, documents disappeared, servants were dismissed, and the causes of his demise remained a source of debate. Though modern historians lean toward a natural end exacerbated by genetic decay, at the time many saw more sinister possibilities. The spread of such suspicions was not accidental. The courts of Europe were like petri dishes of espionage, and foreign powers often had vested interests in destabilizing the Habsburgs from within. Ambassadors, spies, and emissaries floated through imperial salons, carrying gifts, letters, and, according to rumor, poisons. This climate of uncertainty bred not only mistrust among foreign diplomats, but paranoia within the Habsburg family itself. Emperor Joseph II, son of Maria Theresa, was known for his skepticism and deep unease about the loyalty of those around him. He frequently changed his personal staff and grew increasingly isolated in his final years. When he died relatively young and without leaving a strong successor, there were those who questioned whether the emperor's drive to reform the empire had made him enemies strong enough to seek his elimination. Though his autopsy suggested a combination of tuberculosis and other ailments, the secrecy surrounding his condition only deepened the mystery. The most dramatic example of assassination in the Habsburg dynasty came centuries later, with the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. His death on a summer day in the year 1914, at the hands of Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist, is often cited as the spark that ignited the First World War. The incident itself was cloaked in a series of almost surreal missteps, security lapses, last-minute changes in the motorcade route, and a failure to detain the would-be assassin earlier in the day. These errors led some to wonder whether the attack was allowed to happen, or at least not prevented as it might have been. The consequences of Franz Ferdinand's assassination were monumental. Though he had been unpopular within the court, particularly because of his morganatic marriage to Sophie Chotek, his death destabilized an already fragile political system. The tragedy also fed into the belief that the Habsburgs were marked by fate, cursed to suffer losses that transcended reason or probability. Sophie, who died alongside her husband, was never accepted by the court in life, but her death elevated her to the status of a tragic heroine. Their orphaned children, suddenly cast adrift, became living symbols of a dynasty in decline. Other deaths during the final decades of the empire also contributed to the impression of a haunted house unraveling from within. Crown Prince Rudolph's death at Mayerling, still one of the most enigmatic events in Habsburg history, epitomized this mixture of scandal and mystery. Though officially declared a suicide pact between Rudolph and his mistress Mary Vetsera, the story never quite satisfied the public. Some believed that Rudolph had been murdered either by agents of his father to silence his dissenting views or by political enemies hoping to destabilize the empire. Others speculated that the young prince's liberal sympathies and connections with reformist circles had placed him in danger. The lack of transparency surrounding the investigation and the swift removal of evidence from Mayerling only fueled these suspicions. Further complicating matters was the fate of Mary Vetsera's body. Initially buried in secrecy, her remains were exhumed, moved, and even tampered with over the following decades. Personal letters discovered long after the event seemed to support the suicide narrative, but by that time, the story had already embedded itself in popular imagination as a tale of royal murder, forbidden love, and doomed idealism. The idea of a curse began to take root more firmly as such events multiplied. This was not merely the invention of bored courtiers or sensationalist writers. It was a narrative that grew organically from the bewildering repetition of untimely deaths, assassinations, and emotional breakdowns within the family. The Habsburgs themselves occasionally alluded to the possibility, if only half seriously. Empress Elizabeth, long before her own assassination, often spoke of feeling as if she were pursued by fate. Her depressive episodes, her son's death, and her obsession with spiritualism added a mystical dimension to her personality, and after her violent death in Geneva, the myth of the Habsburg curse gained yet another adherent. This myth was strengthened by the atmosphere of Vienna itself in the final years of the empire. The city, once a bastion of imperial power, became a breeding ground for artistic innovation, psychoanalytic theory, and political radicalism. Sigmund Freud's theories of repression and trauma found fertile ground among a population increasingly disillusioned with monarchy and suspicious of its secrets. In this setting, the unexplained and the tragic were interpreted not only as personal misfortunes, but as signs of a deeper structural malaise, symptoms of an empire on the brink of dissolution. Even after the fall of the monarchy in the aftermath of the First World War, the deaths continued to come in unusual and often violent ways. The last emperor, Charles I, died in exile on the island of Madeira, far from the lands he once ruled. Stricken with pneumonia and unable to receive adequate medical treatment, he passed away in relative obscurity in the year 1922. Though his cause of death was medically confirmed, the symbolism of an emperor dying impoverished and powerless in a remote island setting was not lost on observers. For many, it was yet another chapter in the ongoing saga of imperial misfortune. Other members of the Habsburg family fared no better in exile. Some were imprisoned, others executed during the chaos of the Second World War, and still others died in accidents or committed suicide. The family's diaspora scattered them across Europe and the Americas, but even in new lands, the old shadows seemed to follow. The persistence of tragedy, regardless of location or era, only reinforced the sense that the Habsburgs were somehow marked, cursed by history, or perhaps by their own past decisions. Stories of unexplained deaths and suspected plots became part of a larger cultural memory, retold in books, plays, and films. They blurred the line between history and legend, between fact and fiction. The mystery surrounding many of these events was never fully resolved, and perhaps never will be. But the enduring fascination with them speaks to a deeper truth, that the intersection of power, secrecy, and mortality creates a potent narrative force, one that captures the imagination even centuries later. What makes the Habsburg tragedies especially compelling is how they combine the personal and the political. A sudden death was never just a family matter. It had implications for the empire, for alliances, for wars and peace treaties. In this way, every suspicious demise became not only a source of mourning, but also of instability. Assassination and suspected poisoning were not anomalies, but part of the political toolkit of the time, and the Habsburgs, by virtue of their central role in European affairs, were constantly at risk. And yet, despite all the fear, suspicion, and loss, the dynasty endured for centuries. That endurance itself adds to the intrigue. How could a family so repeatedly touched by tragedy continue to rule, to expand, to influence the course of world history? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the mythology that surrounded them. The sense of being destined, even doomed, gave their story a gravity that helped sustain their legitimacy, even when it wavered. Monarchs and ministers came and went, but the legend of the Habsburgs, with all its mysterious deaths and whispered conspiracies, remained. Whether one believes in actual conspiracies, curses, or simply the harsh realities of dynastic politics, the unexplained deaths and constant tension within the Habsburg court reflect a deeper truth about power. That it is never secure, always contested, and often paid for in blood. The Habsburgs, with their towering legacy and tragic human frailties, remind us that the costs of empire are not only measured in battles and borders, but also in the lives that are lost along the way. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in mystery, and often in the flickering space between history and legend. As the sun set on the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the early years of the 20th century, the story of the Habsburg dynasty began to shift from a tale of political dominance and royal ceremony to one of ghosts, shadows, and curses. For centuries, the family had ruled with near unparalleled power across vast swaths of Europe, but even in their prime, they were haunted by a pattern of tragedy that seemed too persistent to ignore. This growing chain of sorrow, marked by unexplained deaths, dynastic failures, scandalous marriages, suicides, assassinations, and emotional collapse, was not forgotten when the empire fell. Rather, it continued to echo through memory, becoming a lens through which people tried to make sense of the monumental collapse that ended centuries of Habsburg rule. As their once mighty realm fractured into pieces and their imperial titles became museum relics, the idea of a Habsburg curse found renewed energy. Whether one believes in curses or not, it is undeniable that the story of the Habsburgs has become one in which history and myth walk side by side. The final collapse of the Habsburg Empire in the year 1918 was as dramatic as any event in their long and winding saga. By that time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had become a sprawling but fragile political entity. It had tried to hold together a diverse population of different nationalities, religions, and languages through a web of bureaucracy, imperial symbolism, and delicate political compromises. Yet underneath the glittering facade of Vienna and the ceremonial order of court life, tensions were growing. Nationalist movements surged in the outer territories. Calls for democratic reform went unheeded or were answered with repression. A sense of political stagnation became increasingly hard to ignore. Then came the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in the summer of the year 1914. This single act set in motion a chain of events that would pull the world into war and ultimately tear the Habsburg Empire apart. Though Franz Ferdinand had been an unpopular figure within the court, largely due to his morganatic marriage and modernizing ideas, his death created a power vacuum and triggered diplomatic tensions that spiraled into the First World War. The empire's military, outdated and unprepared for modern conflict, struggled to keep pace with the rapidly changing nature of warfare. The war effort drained resources, destroyed morale, and heightened nationalist sentiments among the various ethnic groups under Habsburg control. By the time the war ended, the empire was no more. The emperor, Charles I, had attempted to introduce reforms to modernize the monarchy and preserve the union of nations within his empire. But his efforts came too late. He was forced to renounce participation in state affairs and left for exile. In a matter of months, centuries of rule came to an abrupt end. The empire splintered into separate nation-states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others. The once unified imperial structure crumbled, its remnants scattered across maps and across memory. For many at the time, and for countless historians, the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a result of political miscalculation, systemic rigidity, and the inevitable consequence of ignoring internal tensions for too long. And yet, others could not help but see the collapse as something more metaphysical. How could a dynasty that had lasted for so many centuries simply disintegrate in the span of a few years? Why had so many key figures in the Habsburg line met such tragic ends? Could the death of Rudolf at Mayerling, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and the murder of Elizabeth in Geneva all be coincidences? Or were they signs of something darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows all along? The idea of a curse took hold not only in the public imagination but in popular culture, in the writings of historians, novelists, and journalists who began to explore the Habsburg story as a Gothic tragedy rather than simply a historical narrative. The notion of a royal family doomed by fate was irresistible. It explained the otherwise inexplicable: the suicides, the assassinations, the mental breakdowns, and the spectacular fall of a centuries-old empire. More than that, it humanized the Habsburgs. Their lives, once shrouded in ceremonial mystery and imperial distance, became stories of people struggling against forces beyond their control. In the hands of novelists and filmmakers, the Habsburgs became both victims and villains, caught in a web of inherited power and inherited sorrow. One of the reasons this myth of the Habsburg curse endured so powerfully was because it fit the emotional landscape of post-imperial Austria. After the war, the people of Vienna and other former imperial cities were not only mourning lost territory and influence, but also grappling with a deep identity crisis. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had not merely been a political structure. It had been a cultural universe, complete with its own language, customs, and values. Its collapse left a vacuum that myths rushed in to fill. The idea of a curse gave people a way to process collective loss. It made the transition from empire to republic feel less like a political failure and more like a tragic destiny. Even those within the Habsburg family could not entirely escape the myth. The descendants of the dynasty, many of whom lived in exile or quietly in newly republican nations, carried the legacy like a weight. Otto von Habsburg, the son of Charles I, devoted his life to European unity and democracy, becoming a member of the European Parliament and working tirelessly to integrate post-war Europe. Yet even as he tried to move beyond the shadows of his ancestry, journalists and observers often asked him about the curse, about the family's ghosts, about the tragedies that seemed to pursue them through history. Despite his modern achievements, he remained a symbol of a bygone era, one touched by both greatness and grief. The fascination with the Habsburg curse did not wane with time. In fact, in the decades following the Second World War, it gained new dimensions. Writers and filmmakers turned again and again to the story of the Habsburgs, especially to the lives of tragic figures like Elizabeth and Rudolph. Their stories were retold in operettas, plays, television dramas, and historical fiction. Each time, the details shifted slightly, the tone adjusted to the cultural moment, but the central theme remained the same. This was a family marked by fate, brought down by a combination of their own choices and something ineffable, something inescapable. Of course, historians have rightly warned against romanticizing or oversimplifying the past. The idea of a curse can obscure more than it reveals. It can turn complex political, social, and economic processes into the stuff of fable. The fall of the Habsburgs was not the result of supernatural forces, but of human ones. Wars poorly managed, reforms too slow, societies yearning for self-determination. But the persistence of the curse narrative points to something else. The human need to find patterns, to tell stories, to connect cause with consequence in a way that makes emotional sense even if it defies rational analysis. In the case of the Habsburgs, their long history of accumulated sorrow makes it easy to conflate myth with fact. The sheer number of tragic events in the family, many of them occurring within just a few generations, creates a compelling narrative arc. And because they were a royal family, their lives were public in ways that ordinary tragedies are not. When a crown prince dies in a suicide pact, it becomes more than a personal tragedy. It becomes a national and even international moment, ripe for myth-making. When an empress is murdered by an anarchist, it echoes beyond the headlines into the realm of symbolism. This blending of myth and reality is not unique to the Habsburgs, but few families have experienced it as intensely. Their story spans continents and centuries, touches on every major historical event in Europe from the medieval period to the modern age, and involves a cast of characters whose lives seem almost scripted for drama. The curse narrative, for all its exaggeration, serves as a kind of emotional shorthand, a way for people to engage with the complexity of history through the simplicity of a story. And in that story, the Habsburgs are not just rulers. They are protagonists in an epic tale of ambition, beauty, loss, and ultimately collapse. As time moves further away from the days of empires and imperial courts, the Habsburgs continue to occupy a unique place in collective memory. In Austria and Hungary, their legacy is still visible in architecture, in street names, in museums, and in cultural memory. Tourists flock to the Hofburg and Schönbrunn palaces in Vienna, imagining the lives of emperors and empresses who once walked those halls. Yet even in these physical spaces, the specter of the past lingers. The golden grandeur of the Baroque salons is inseparable from the sadness of the figures who once ruled from them. In schools and universities, the Habsburg story is still taught, but often with an emphasis on its tragic arc. The dynasty that ruled over one of the most diverse empires in the world is remembered not only for its administrative achievements, but also for its inability to adapt, its insular thinking, and its personal sorrows. The myth of the curse, while not a historical fact, has become part of that teaching, an example of how public perception can shape and even distort the legacy of a royal family. The tale of the Habsburg curse prompts deeper questions about how we remember history. What makes certain stories endure? Why do we cling to ideas of destiny, fate, and retribution, even when the evidence points elsewhere? Perhaps it is because history is not just a collection of dates and treaties. It is also a human story, filled with emotions, contradictions, and the need for meaning. And in the case of the Habsburgs, that meaning often comes wrapped in tragedy. The final echo of the curse is not a dramatic death or a final betrayal. It is the lingering sense that even the most powerful are vulnerable to the same forces that touch all human lives: loss, love, failure, and the relentless march of time. It is the reminder that behind the crowns and titles were real people, some noble, some flawed, most shaped by the circumstances of their birth and the heavy expectations that came with it. The Habsburgs, for all their influence and ambition, were not immune to the consequences of their actions, nor to the accidents of fate. Whether one sees the Habsburg curse as a metaphor, a myth, or a superstition, its endurance speaks to the power of story. It reveals how the boundaries between fact and legend can blur, especially when the past is filled with as much sorrow as it is with splendor. And it invites us to reflect not only on what happened, but on how we choose to remember it. In the story of the Habsburgs, history and myth are not enemies. They are partners in a long, haunting tale that continues to captivate the imagination, long after the empire itself has vanished from the map.